A young man in a worn jacket with a red and white armband on his sleeve carefully lifts the heavy manhole cover, and the sharp, incomparable smell of the dungeons, mixed with the stench of the sleeping metropolis in ruins, hits his nostrils. He listens to the hum coming from the east, from the river, where shadows of a huge army are frozen behind a dark strip of water. There, on the other bank, in the suburb called Praga, rare shots and the rumble of engines are heard, but this sound does not approach, but seems to have frozen in some strange, frightening anticipation. The young man knows that his comrades in the central districts have been fighting an unequal battle for several hours, using only light equipment and makeshift devices against the enemy's heavy machinery. He clutches a crumpled note in his hand and steps into the darkness of the well, understanding that the fate of an entire district depends on his ability to make his way through the labyrinths of the sewers. At that moment, on August 1st, 1944, at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the first salvos rang out over the city, marking the beginning of an event that would later be called one of the most tragic and controversial pages in the history of World War II. The whole world, holding its breath, watched as the ancient capital turned into an arena for the clash of not only armies, but also global political ambitions, where every step was dictated by cold calculation and strategic advantage, leaving aside the fates of hundreds of thousands of civilians. The situation that developed in midsummer 1944 was unique and extremely tense. Soviet troops during the large-scale Operation Bagration dealt a crushing blow to Army Group Center, advancing hundreds of kilometers westward in an incredibly short time. The front line was rapidly approaching the Vistula, and it seemed that the fall of German dominance in the region was a matter of days. In Warsaw, which had been under oppression for almost 5 years, the realization grew that the decisive moment had come. The underground organization known as the Home Army, subordinate to the government in London, understood. If the city were liberated exclusively by Soviet units, the political future of sovereign Poland would be jeopardized. The plan, codenamed Burza, Tempest, implied that local forces should strike the rear of the retreating Wehrmacht units, seize key facilities, and meet the advancing Allies as legitimate masters of their land. This was an attempt to assert their rights to sovereignty in conditions where the great powers had already begun to divide spheres of influence on maps in Tehran. The expectation of imminent aid from the east was reinforced by radio station reports urging the population to take active action. However, behind this external striving for freedom lay a complex knot of contradictions, where military expediency intertwined with deep distrust between the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. The external contour of events developed according to the classic laws of military confrontation, but with unexpected adjustments. By the end of July 1944, the advanced detachments of the 2nd Tank Army of the 1st Belarusian Front reached the approaches to the eastern part of Warsaw. The German command, realizing the critical importance of this defensive knot, began to hastily transfer reserves, including elite divisions such as Hermann Göring and Viking. A major tank battle took place in the Radzimin area, as a result of which Soviet units suffered significant losses and were forced to go on the defensive. From the point of view of pure military art, the supply lines of the advancing troops were stretched for hundreds of kilometers, air cover was working at its limit, and the wear and tear of equipment required an operational pause. 10 Wehrmacht divisions, concentrated in the city area, represented a formidable force capable of delivering a sensitive counterattack. At the same time, in Warsaw itself, approximately 40,000 resistance fighters, only 1 in 4 of whom had full equipment, entered into open confrontation with a garrison numbering over 15,000 well-equipped soldiers, supported by armored trains and aviation. The disparity in forces was obvious, but the calculation was based on surprise and on the assumption that the enemy was already psychologically broken by the large-scale retreat of recent weeks. The inner turmoil of the participants in those events adds particular depth and drama to the picture. General Tadeusz Komorowski, in making the final decision to start the uprising, was under immense pressure. On the one hand, he saw the enthusiasm of young fighters who were ready to give everything for the chance to see their city free. On the other hand, he realized that without direct external support, whether Allied airborne landings from Italy or an offensive by troops across the Vistula, the uprising was doomed to a slow demise. At the same time, on the other bank of the river, Soviet Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, who had Polish roots, was receiving direct orders from central headquarters. His actions were limited by the scope of the global offensive plan, and any attempts at unauthorized aid to the rebels could be considered a breach of discipline. Personal letters and memoirs of soldiers of that time testify to a tormenting sense of powerlessness. Those who stood on the banks of the Vistula saw smoke over the city, heard the sounds of cannon fire, and did not understand why they were ordered to dig trenches and wait, while just a couple of kilometers away, their brothers in arms were fighting a desperate battle. This was an internal conflict between professional duty, ideological conviction, and simple human empathy that tore at the souls of many participants in the frontline actions. The ideological clash in this story is even more fundamental. Here, two concepts of Europe's future collided. For the Polish government in exile, the uprising was the highest act of national self-determination, proof that the nation was alive and ready to fight for its values independently. For the leadership in Moscow, the Home Army appeared to be a tool of hostile circles seeking to restore the old order and create a barrier against the spread of influence of the new system. Joseph Stalin, in his correspondence with Winston Churchill, called the leaders of the uprising a bunch of criminals who had embarked on an adventure without coordinating it with the general offensive plan. This definition not only revealed ideological antagonism, but also extremely cold pragmatism. Why help those who would become political opponents in the future? The paradox was that ordinary people, building barricades of cobblestones and furniture, believed they were fighting against a common enemy of humanity, while at the highest level, their efforts were viewed through the prism of geopolitical chess, where pieces could be sacrificed for future positional advantage. The moment arrived when the situation definitively moved from the stage of operational possibility to the stage of a protracted crisis. In mid-August 1944, it became definitively clear that a rapid link-up of forces would not occur. The Soviet leadership refused the Western Allies permission to use their airfields for shuttle bombing runs that could deliver supplies to Warsaw. This decision effectively blocked the possibility of effective air support, as planes from Italy would have had to fly across all of Europe and return without refueling, which made such missions practically impossible. It was then that a fundamental shift in the perception of events occurred. The uprising ceased to be part of the general liberation movement and turned into an isolated hotbed of resistance. Feeling this isolation, the German command began a methodical destruction of city blocks, using heavy artillery and special units trained in urban warfare. Every house became a small fortress, and every street became a place where the fate of entire units was decided. The insurgents were forced underground, creating a unique communication system in the sewer collectors, which became the only way to connect the disparate areas of the city. The culmination of events occurred in September 1944. Attempts by some units of the Polish army, formed on Soviet territory, to cross the Vistula and support the rebels resulted only in heavy losses and a lack of significant results due to insufficient artillery support. The city plunged into a state of humanitarian catastrophe. Shortages of food, clean water, and medicines became a more dangerous enemy than shells. In conditions where each new day brought only new losses, the resistance leadership began to realize the inevitability of the end. In October 1944, an agreement was signed to cease hostilities. The terms were unique in their own way. The soldiers of the Home Army were recognized as combatants and received the rights of prisoners of war, which saved thousands of lives from immediate reprisal. However, the city itself faced a much harsher end. By special order, block after block was systematically destroyed. Architectural monuments and libraries turned to dust. By the time, in mid-January 1945, units of the First Belarusian Front finally entered Warsaw, they saw, instead of a once flourishing metropolis, an empty space filled with rubble and ashes, where only the wind disturbed the silence. Analyzing those events today, we encounter lessons that go far beyond military history. The Warsaw Uprising became a symbol of how easily moral impulse and the desire for freedom can become hostages of great interests and strategic calculations. It showed that in global conflicts, trust between allies is often a fragile illusion, and real decisions are made based on maps of the future world order, not current humanitarian needs. This is a reminder that sovereignty is not only the right to vote, but also the ability to adequately assess the real balance of power and the possibilities of support. History teaches us that the heroism of individuals can be used as small change in games where the rules are determined not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of offices. At the same time, the resilience of the city's defenders remains an example of the unyielding will of a nation that, even in conditions of absolute hopelessness, finds the strength to assert its existence. This legacy makes us reflect on the price of political decisions and the responsibility leaders bear to those who entrust them with their lives. Today's view of those 82 days of struggle allows us to see in them not just defeat or success, but a complex mosaic of human destinies. The shadows of the past continue to roam the modern avenues of Warsaw, where every rebuilt house is a monument to the will to revival. That very young man who once descended into a manhole could today be a grandfather telling his grandchildren about the importance of connection and how bitter it is to look at a river, knowing that help stands on the other bank, help that will not come. This story brings us back to the idea that in the great achievements and tragedies of the past, there is always room for personal choice and personal responsibility. It calls on us to value a world where dialogue and understanding can prevent cities from turning into ruins. And when the sun sets over the Vistula today, it illuminates not a front line, but a living, breathing city that has managed to outgrow its deepest trauma, transforming it into a source of wisdom and strength for future generations, reminding us that memory is not only sorrow, but also a foundation for a future where such paradoxes of pragmatism and hope will never again lead to such a sad conclusion. The events of that autumn of 1944 remain in popular memory as an example of the highest manifestation of spirit, which encountered the icy cold of geopolitics. External circumstances, such as the exhaustion of Soviet troops after a rapid march of 700 kilometers and the need for regrouping, certainly took place and are confirmed by many archival documents of that time. Military historians point out that an attempt to take Warsaw on the fly without proper preparation could have led to catastrophic consequences for the entire front and prolonged general actions against the common enemy for many more months. However, it is impossible to ignore the fact that political will could have found ways to provide at least symbolic but effective support if the goals of the rebels coincided with the long-term plans of the leadership in Moscow. This conflict of interpretations continues to exist today, dividing researchers into those who see in it a harsh military necessity and those who find confirmation of a cynical calculation aimed at eliminating future political rivals by the hands of the enemy. When we look at detailed maps of troop dispositions in those days, we see that Soviet bridgeheads on the left bank of the Vistula, such as Magnushev and Puavi, were located several tens of kilometers south of the city. The battles for their retention were extremely fierce, and the German command threw its best forces there to prevent further breakthroughs to the borders of its territory. This confirms the thesis that the front was not static, and the assertion of complete inaction of Soviet units is somewhat of a simplification of reality. At the same time, the redeployment of aviation regiments and the change in priorities for strikes in favor of other directions clearly demonstrate that Warsaw at that moment was not on the list of priority tasks for the central headquarters. This multi-layered situation makes it impossible to issue an unambiguous verdict, leaving room for deep reflection on the nature of power and the price of victory. The inner world of the city dwellers, caught in the ring, gradually changed from enthusiasm to despair, and finally to a kind of detached calm of people who had accepted their fate. In the basements of residential buildings, not only infirmaries were organized, but also printing houses, postal services, and even small workshops for producing equipment. People continued to marry, publish newspapers, and hold cultural evenings to the accompaniment of explosions. This was an attempt to maintain normalcy in a world gone mad, a declaration of human dignity in the face of an inevitable end. The relationship between the civilian population and the soldiers of the Home Army also underwent a transformation. If at the beginning of the uprising support was almost universal, by the end of the second month, when hunger and disease became widespread, discontent began to grow, along with the understanding that the price for the attempt at political self-assertion had turned out to be exorbitant. These internal contradictions within Polish society itself are also an important part of the overall picture, which cannot be ignored for the sake of creating a simplified, heroic myth. The philosophical aspect of this confrontation lies in the question, does political expediency have the right to stand above human life on such a scale? If one considers the state as the highest value, then the actions of Stalin and Komorowski can be understood as logical within their frames of reference. One sought to ensure the security of his borders and the loyalty of the future regime. The other, to preserve the independence of his people. But if one focuses on the specific individual, that very young liaison officer or soldier in a trench on the other side, the picture turns into a global failure of humanity. This clash of ideas about what is more important, the future of a nation or the present of its citizens, remains relevant today, surfacing in every conflict where the interests of powers intersect on the lands of third parties. The transformation of the perception of these events on a global scale occurred gradually. In the first post-war decades, in Poland itself, the topic of the uprising was shrouded in a veil of censorship and official interpretations, which portrayed the leadership of the Home Army exclusively as adventurers. However, in people's hearts and in family traditions, a completely different truth was preserved. With the change in the political landscape at the end of the 1980s, a process of large-scale re-evaluation began. Archives were opened, and the memoirs of those who had been silent for many years became available. This led to the uprising taking its place as a central element of national identity, a symbol of the struggle against any oppression regardless of its source. Modern Warsaw is literally permeated with signs of that era, from small plaques on the walls of houses marking the places where people died, to the majestic museum, which, with the help of modern technologies, immerses visitors in the atmosphere of those days. The significance of the lessons of Warsaw is particularly acutely felt today in the context of international security. We see how important it is to have clear and transparent channels of communication between allies. How dangerous it is to rely on unspoken agreements, and how critical it is to be able to separate military objectives from political intrigues. The history of 1944 reminds us that indifference and cold-blooded observation of a neighbor's tragedy sooner or later turn into moral and political losses for the observer himself. It teaches us responsibility for promises made and for the tone in which we conduct dialogue with those in distress. As we conclude this narrative, we return once more to that moment when thick smoke hung over the Vistula, and no planes with aid could be seen in the sky. The young man, emerging from a manhole in the city center, saw not ruin before him, but an opportunity to act. His path through the darkness and grime of the underground was a metaphor for the path of an entire nation, striving for light through the gloom of occupation and betrayal. And although that particular battle was lost and the city razed to the ground, the very idea of freedom proved stronger than stone and steel. Today, as we walk through bustling streets, we must remember that this ease of being is paid for with the heavy currency of the past. The final thought that should resonate in everyone is the realization that history is not a collection of dry facts. It is a living process in which each of us is a participant, and what the news headlines will be in the future depends on the lessons we learn from the events on the banks of the Vistula in 1944. We are obliged to remember the pragmatism of those who made decisions and the heroism of those who carried them out, so that never again will cynicism be allowed to defeat hope, or silence to replace action in moments when the very human right to life and freedom in one's hometown is at stake. Passing by monuments erected in honor of those events, one can notice that they often depict not generals in dress uniforms, but ordinary people, postmen, nurses, young fighters. This emphasizes the popular character of the resistance. In conditions where regular armies were solving continental-scale tasks, ordinary residents of Warsaw were solving the task of preserving their dignity. Their struggle for 63 days against superior enemy forces became one of the longest urban battles in the history of that war. Every morning began with a search for food under shelling, and every evening ended with a prayer or a brief news summary that the front in the east was still at a standstill. This chronology of waiting became a psychological torture that for many proved harder than participating in the battles themselves. It is interesting to consider the technical side of how the city survived in isolation. Underground master gunsmiths managed to assemble submachine guns of their own design, such as the Błyskawica, in deep basements using primitive machines. This is a testament to incredible ingenuity and will to resist. At the same time, the German command used the most advanced means of that time, including Goliath self-propelled mines and heavy mortars of 600 mm caliber, which could collapse an entire building with one shot. The contrast between the homemade weapons of the insurgents and the industrial might of the Wehrmacht emphasized the tragedy of the situation. It was a battle of living spirit against a soulless machine of destruction, in which the outcome was technically predetermined, but not morally. The outcome of the uprising was overshadowed not only by military defeat, but also by the bitterness of realizing that help was so close. In the last days of September, when the last pockets of resistance in Mokotów and Joliborz began to die out, many fighters tried to cross the river on improvised rafts. The few who succeeded spoke of a strange feeling they experienced, finding themselves safe on the other side. Behind them, the world they knew was dying, and before them stood a huge, well-fed and silent army that could have saved them, but had not received orders. This moment of truth became decisive for relations between Poland and its eastern neighbor for many decades to come, laying the foundation for mistrust that is felt even in modern political discourse. However, it is important to remember that history is not just black and white. Among Soviet officers and soldiers, there were many who genuinely yearned for battle for Warsaw. There is evidence of pilots attempting to drop food against orders, of artillerymen who tried to suppress German firing points in the city as far as their guns allowed. These human impulses are often lost in the shadow of Stalin's grand political decisions, but they are important for understanding that even in the darkest times, people remain people, capable of compassion against the will of dictators. It is precisely such details that make the historical canvas alive and three-dimensional, preventing it from turning into a flat poster. The contemporary significance of the Warsaw Uprising is also revealed through the prism of the city's reconstruction. A unique case in history, when after the complete destruction of its buildings, the capital was practically recreated in its original form, based on old blueprints and photographs. This became the final point in the dispute with those who wanted to erase Polish culture from the world map. The reconstruction of Warsaw is also part of that very uprising, its peaceful and creative phase. It shows that victory over cynicism and destruction is possible even years later, if a nation has the will to preserve its memory and heritage. Today, as we analyze those events, we understand that the lessons of 1944 are universal. They tell us that any military strategy must take into account humanitarian consequences, and any political ambition must have a limit, beyond which simple human mercy begins. We see how paradoxically intertwined the fates of peoples are, and how important it is to be able to acknowledge past mistakes in order to build an honest future. The Warsaw Uprising remains for us not only a history lesson, but also a measure of our own capacity for empathy and responsibility. It calls upon us to be vigilant and not allow human lives to be turned into numbers on strategic maps. In conclusion of our immersion into this complex and dramatic period, it is worth recalling once again that very hook, a personal moment of choice in the face of uncertainty. The history of Warsaw is millions of such moments from which a magnificent and tragic canvas was woven. It is a narrative of how a city became a symbol that cannot be destroyed by shells. And although pragmatism and harsh military necessity dictated their conditions in 1944, in the long run, victory was won by the spirit of those who believed in the truth of their cause. This belief continues to live in today's Warsaw, reminding each of us that the true greatness of a nation is measured not only by its victories, but also by its ability to stand for its ideals to the very end, even when the whole world seems to have turned away and frozen in expectation on the other side of the river. Every year, on August 1st, at 1700 hours, all of Warsaw freezes. Cars stop, buses stop, people on the sidewalks stand still, and the wail of sirens echoes over the city. This is a moment of silence in which time seems to turn back, connecting modernity with that very moment of the uprising's beginning. In this silence, there is no place for political disputes or division into pragmatists and idealists. there is only an acknowledgement of common human pain and common heroism. This cyclical return to the source allows each new generation to feel a connection to history and realize that they are continuators of a long path to freedom. And in this minute lies the deepest understanding of all the lessons of the past. We remember to live, and we live to remember. This is the main resonance that the Warsaw Uprising transmits to us through the decades, urging us to cherish every moment of peace and every opportunity to lend a hand to those in need, without waiting for orders and without calculating benefits on the scales of grand politics. After all, ultimately it is our ability to remain human in inhumane conditions that determines our place in the history of humankind, making us worthy of the memory of those who once decided on this desperate and beautiful step into the unknown for the sake of the future of their city and their country. This story has no definitive endpoint. It continues to be written by every researcher, every tourist in a museum, and every child asking about the meaning of a monument in their yard. It teaches us that historical truth is often bitter and uncomfortable, but only through its acceptance can true reconciliation and advancement be achieved. We see how important it is to maintain documentary accuracy and not succumb to the temptation of simplifying complex narratives for the sake of current political expediency. Only in this way can we build a world where the tragedies of the past become a reliable shield against the repetition of similar mistakes in the future. And may the echo of those days, reverberating from the walls of the old city, remind us that behind every great event stand living people with their fears and hopes. And it is their stories that deserve to be told honestly, deeply, and to the very end.